The first point to ponder is that God brings the greatest blessings from the least. A young girl, insignificant by the world's standards, a mere peasant girl, transforms the world by her little act of faith, by a simple yes. Her little act of faith and obedience has done more for mankind than all the great generals and emperors that have ever lived. For her act brought the Savior, Jesus Christ, into the world. God is not content forcing salvation on mankind. He wants to work through our free will to further glorify us. God does not demand great acts of heroism and courage from all men. He desires the constant little acts of obedience and faith from which great things will spring forth. On the other hand, the great actions done apart from God will amount to nothing. The second point to consider is the bridging of the chasm between God and mankind. There was a time in history, beginning with Adam and Eve's original sin, where a chasm between God and man existed. This abyss condemned mankind to their fallen nature and an eternity of separation from God. With Mary's yes, God and mankind are forever united in the person of Jesus Christ. This sinful condition, which has lasted for thousands of years, ended forever with the Annunciation. With Mary's little yes, the exile was over. Despite all the greatness of Adam, Moses, and David, the great gap between God and mankind remained. It was with Mary, a young peasant girl, that the chasm was closed forever. The third point to ponder is the abandoning of personal plans for God's plan. The Annunciation also illustrates the need to abandon one's personal desires and dreams for something greater. Before the Annunciation, Mary, like all young girls, had personal ambitions and desires. God had something different in mind. As with most people, God often wants something far greater and glorious than the short-sighted goals of men. God desires for each of us something far greater than we could have ever imagined in our wildest dreams. But for God's will to be accomplished, we must, oftentimes, be willing to forsake our own dreams and place our trust in God. In the case of Mary, she abandoned her little dreams to become the Mother of God and the Queen of all creation. The fourth point to consider is the spiritual soul versus the physical appearance. It is interesting that Mary's physical appearance is never mentioned. She is the most revered creature in all creation, and the Bible does not give a physical description of her. The reason for the lack of physical description is that she is remembered by who she was and not by her physical characteristics. Mary is revered for the state of her soul by her actions, not by any extraordinary physical attributes she possessed. As it will be with us, we will not be remembered by how we looked or what earthly milestones we obtained. Instead, we will be viewed by how perfectly we emulated Christ. The fifth point to consider is that nothing is out of God's control. The Annunciation is a perfect illustration of how nothing is out of the control of God. No matter how sinful the world had become, God was able to accomplish His will. The genealogy which led up to the conception of Christ was less than perfect, full of sinful activity, and yet the sinful activity ultimately could not undermine God's will. A great artist is not necessarily one who can paint a beautiful portrait, but one who could take the worst portrait and make it beautiful. Looking at salvation history, it appears as though the devil was playing into God's hands the whole time. As displayed with the genealogy of Christ, God can make good come from evil, but God can bring an even greater good with the obedience and devotion to God, as displayed by God's humble obedience. The sixth point to consider is that God does not promise us an easy life. The Annunciation shows that God does not make life easy on His followers. Quite the opposite, God actually makes life on earth more difficult for those who follow Him. If God so chose, He could have come to Mary on her wedding night, with Joseph present and made it easy on her. Instead, the angel Gabriel came to Mary alone and well before her marriage to Joseph. These circumstances placed Mary in an uncomfortable and possibly dangerous situation. She had to explain her sudden pregnancy to Joseph and her fellow townfolk without a convincing reason. She had to face the ridicule and rejection of her friends, family, and possibly Joseph, and could quite possibly have been stoned without committing a single sin. Regardless, she trusted God would take care of her, which he did. Like Mary, when God makes it difficult for us, we must do what is right and trust God will take care of the rest. The next point to consider is the angel Gabriel, the messenger of God. By all appearances in the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel has been reduced to the duties of a messenger. Not only is he bringing a message to a human being, who by all appearances are far inferior to angels, but he is also bringing a message to a peasant girl, someone who is considered low in the hierarchy of human beings. This job seems to be degrading, but with the Annunciation, a new precedent is set opposite of the natural order of things. When Christ, infinitely greater than all creation, serves the least of all creation, there is no excuse for the rest of creation not to follow suit. Not only does it become necessary to serve those below, but it also becomes a badge of honor because you are emulating the greatest, Jesus Christ. So the task of being a messenger becomes the greatest honor that could be bestowed upon the angel Gabriel, most especially due to the nature of the message. The next point to consider is that decisions of individuals set the course of mankind. The Annunciation also illustrates God's intent that individuals make decisions for humanity. God allows single people to make decisions that will affect the course of humanity as a whole, for the good and the bad. Adam and Eve, with their first sin, allowed sin to seep into human nature, which tainted all human beings, without their consent. With Mary's decision, mankind was again united with God. Most choices in life are not communal decisions, but individual ones that will eventually affect all people. Humans do not live in a vacuum. What is done in secret will eventually become public. Little acts of kindness will eventually blossom into bright and glorious flowers, while quiet acts of pride will form poisonous weeds. The next point to consider with the Annunciation is Christ's willingness to share in his glory. Christ could have hoarded all the attention. Christ could have overshadowed every character in the Bible, and all the names in the Bible could have been removed, leaving only himself. Christ did not need to use all the characters in the Old Testament to prophesy his coming. He did not need to use a little peasant girl to bring him into the world. What Christ did instead was allow other people to not only share in the responsibility of God's saving work, but also share in the glory and honor that he was to receive. The Old Testament brings to mankind men like Moses and David, and the New, people like Peter and Paul. The most perfect example of Christ's willingness to share in his glory is with his mother, Mary. The last point to consider with the Annunciation is humility. The Annunciation illustrates the difference between humility and false humility. Mary proclaims that all generations will call her blessed, which is quite a statement. It would seem boastful even for the greatest king. With those words, she is claiming that people thousands of years later will not only know her, but will also exalt her name. A comment such as that might be confused as pride, and far from being humble. The difference is Mary is not building up herself beyond the truth. She is stating the truth, and stating it not to glorify herself, but in order to glorify God. Only God could take somebody like Mary and make her transform the world. She is not seeing herself apart from Christ, but illustrates her dependence on Christ and the role she plays in God's plan of salvation for all mankind.